Okay, well, good evening. Welcome back to our second event for 2022. Welcome to our regulars and any new people this week. Welcome also to those watching on Facebook and to anybody listening to the audio replay of this session, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday on J-Air Community Radio, which is FM 88 in Melbourne, or everywhere else at j.air.com.au. Now, there's also a podcast available from the J-Air website, and we'll circulate details of that, and that can be accessed at any time. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our special guest for tonight, Caroline Glick, who we will formally introduce in a moment. This week is our usual format where we will chat with Caroline for about 35 minutes or so, after which we will open up for questions from the audience. Now, questions from our Zoom participants. It is important that you raise your hand electronically because that way we know that you want to ask a question, and then David can unmute you or allow you to unmute yourself in order to ask your question. The way to do that is to click on the reaction icon at the bottom of the screen and you'll see a little hand. So clicking on that puts the icon up in the corner. Now, written questions can also be placed on the chat function, and Robert Gregory, our Public Affairs Director, will read out some of these in between the spoken ones. Okay, Caroline Glick is of course extremely well known around the world for her incisive commentary on Israel and the Middle East, and we will cover some of that territory tonight. But one issue that doesn't get talked about, maybe as much as it should, is that of the Jewish diaspora and its relationship to Israel and Jewish continuity. No doubt the staunch Zionists will say that all of us in the diaspora should be making Aliyah, and probably we should. But tonight we want to look at this issue through a political lens. And certainly the major influencer of diaspora issues has to be the United States. And equally certainly the so-called progressive mindset of the majority of American Jews is having a negative impact on Israel because of their left-wing ideology and diminished Jewish identity. As someone who has lived in both countries and is an expert on the politics of the Jewish world, Caroline is going to help us navigate through some of the issues involved. Perhaps I won't read out her entire bio, as I'm positive everyone here is already a big fan of her articles that appear in many of the online journals we receive. And when we see her live, we can. And of course, Caroline has been to Australia. She visited some years ago, but we're delighted to have her back, albeit via Zoom. Caroline, welcome to the AJA and thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be talking to the Australian Jewish community again. I did come to Australia with my kids in 2017, and some of our fondest memories are from that trip, not only because Australia is so extraordinary, but also because of the warmth and hospitality that you and your community gave to us, showered upon us. So we really, that's one of our fondest memories. And I said at the time, they were little, and I said, when you're big, before my oldest goes to the army, we'll come back here, and then you'll be big enough to go hiking in the outback. So beware, we may be back.
Okay, you're welcome anytime.
All right, thanks.
Caroline, we've all watched with dismay how the attitude of American Jews towards Israel has eroded with successive generations over the last few decades. And we're seeing a similar phenomenon happening here in Australia. But given what we know now about Jewish history since World War II, was this drop in interest about Israel inevitable, or did the Jewish world either do something wrong or not do something it should have?
Well, I think that you have to distinguish between the American Jewish community and all other diaspora communities for a very simple reason, which is that from the outset of the American project, even at the time of the British colonies, the Jews who came to the New World, who came to the United States, viewed themselves as different and distinct and separate from Jewish history. They felt that they were reaching a new promised land, and that and really even before there was the reform movement in Judaism in Germany in the mid 19th century that caught on like wildfire in the United States about 15 years later, there was already a sense among American Jews that the things that happen to other Jews all around the world aren't going to happen to them there. The founding fathers of the United States, George Washington, John Adams in particular, were Philo-Semites. They viewed themselves as the new Jerusalem, and this goes back to the earliest European settlers in the New World, the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So that was that mindset of American Jews from the outset of the American Jewish Project made them separate and distinct. The idea that the promised land for them was the United States and not the land of Israel, that they weren't an exile community. These are things that you had for short periods, bleeps on the screen in Europe, in Germany, and in France, with the Enlightenment movement, with the liberation from the ghettos in the 19th century. Those obviously were short-lived. Actually, you had it in Warsaw as well, in Poland, but it was there was never such an ingrained sense that these communities were cut off from Jewish history and that they had a different fate from every other exile community, that it wasn't an exile, that it was a permanent home for the Jews of America. And that mindset changed or has impacted their view of Israel and Zionism all along, because, and we saw this, and again, I'm saying that it's distinct in the United States, mainly because these views were more widespread. They were from the outset mainstream, and in other diaspora communities, they were not. So you had it with very wealthy British Jews as well, Lord Montagu first and foremost, who felt that the modern Zionist movement was a threat to their position, because by reawakening or seeking to rebuild the Jewish Commonwealth in the Jewish homeland, the land of Israel, that the Zionist Jews were going to endanger the position that wealthy and successful Jews had built for themselves in exile communities, particularly in Britain and in the United States. So you had that fear of Zionism among the very successful Jews in Western, in particular, diaspora communities. But because this was the view of the American Jewish community, the American Jewish community viewed Zionism as a charity project, as opposed to a project for national renewal and renaissance and rebirth. And I guess that's Renaissance. And so they viewed the Zionists in the land of Israel, to whom they gave a lot of money, but mainly as a charity case that wasn't related to them. That Aliyah was for other Jews, it wasn't for them. That Zionism for American Jews meant supporting Israel, not wanting to join the Jewish people in the national homeland of Israel. And so that view changed and shifted for a brief period after the Six-Day War. And it shifted, and here too, you have to understand that the American Jewish community, part of the idea of seeing themselves as a separate and distinct Jewish community and the United States as a new promised land, meant that they also were an assimilatory diaspora from the outset, that they always wanted to assimilate into the larger community. And so much of the view that American Jews had towards Israel was actually a response to the views of Israel that the wider majority of Americans, non-Jewish Americans had towards Israel. So there was, I mean, Americans in general were by and large supportive of Israel, although in the 1930s and 40s, and the 20s, America was highly anti-Semitic. But after the Six-Day War, with Israel's tremendous victory and triumph in that war, the floodgates of support of the Americans opened up, and particularly among evangelical Christians who began to see, which are a very, very, very large percentage of Americans, began to see in Israel the fulfillment of God's promise to the Jewish people. And so they saw this as a spiritual moment, not only for Jews, but for Christians. And so you had a massive increase in American support for Israel, and that was also reflected in a much greater support among American Jews for Israel. You had a significant wave of aliyah from young American Jews after the Six-Day War. Obviously everything is relative, but relative to the paltry aliyah numbers that you had experienced in the 1950s and the early 1960s, there was a tremendous increase in aliyah rates from the United States in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And you also just had, you had the reform movement for the first time becoming pro-Israel and Zionist and embracing Zionism. Reform Judaism, which rejects Jewish peoplehood, changed their theology after the Six-Day War and embraced Zionism. The American Jewish Committee, which is a very large Jewish organization, was anti-Zionist until after the Six-Day War. Commentary Magazine, which many of you may read, which was the premier journal of Jewish affairs and the Jewish intellectual affairs in the United States for decades, they were anti-Zionist until after the Six-Day War. And then they became Zionists. So that the Six-Day War had a profound effect on American Jews. But because American Jews' first impulse was to view themselves as Americans and cut off from the idea of the land of Israel and the people of Israel, and to a large degree as largely Reform and conservative Jews from the Torah of Israel, the depth of the Zionism, or the Zionism itself, was not very deep. It never really became something that set aside the idea that their primary identity was as Americans.
Yeah, that's a very interesting distinction, because, and it's probably not one that we've appreciated here in Australia, because our Jewish community really only exploded after the war. So Israel was formed and our Jewish community exploded. And so there wasn't this contest or seeking of attention on two different fronts. So that's a very interesting angle. And of course, our immigrants were largely Holocaust survivors. And of course, we had Holocaust Remembrance Day a week or so ago. And I actually read an article in the Jerusalem Post commemorating the way Holocaust Remembrance Day was celebrated in Israel. It almost seemed as if it was almost unexpected that they were going to so much trouble to support Holocaust Remembrance Day. But what are your observations in Israel and in the diaspora? And are you worried that other diaspora communities are going to let go of this Holocaust remembrance concept a bit too easily?
I'll tell you the truth, I'm not a big fan, and I haven't been a big fan since of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, because it came about in a very, I felt, corrupt way, morally speaking, because it came about when Kofi Annan was the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he had spurred this blood libel against Israel, claiming that we had massacred hundreds of Palestinians in the Battle of Jenin during Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. And he came up under a lot of criticism because the UN had to revise their numbers from 500 to 51, where 51 of the Palestinians were all terrorists. And so it was a complete lie. And to try to get out from under a growing swell of allegations that were correct, that he had propagated a blood libel against the Jewish state, he latched onto this idea that, and I felt that it was also morally wrong, what happened, which was that the American Jewish Committee and other leading American Jewish organizations held out a lifeline to him and said, hey, let's do International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And he said, great. And then he got all of this credit, the man who had just propagated a blood libel against Israel, for being a friend of the Jews because he agreed to have this International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Now, Israelis and Jews in general don't need another Holocaust Remembrance Day. We have Yom HaShoah, and that's our day. And I found that more and more, and you see it still today, that Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th is used by governments and by activists who hate and despise Israel, who are waging political wars against Israel, calling for the boycott of Israel economically and the ostracism of Israel's supporters, particularly Jewish, throughout the Western world. And they wrap themselves up in this garb of being philo-Semitic by saying that they bow their heads for the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. But in the meantime, they're working towards the destruction of the Jewish state and the largest Jewish community in the world. So I'm not personally a big fan of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I think that people who want to persecute Jews who are alive should not get a free pass for what they're doing because they say that they're sorry about the Holocaust.
Yeah, good
so
point.
That's my own personal view of Holocaust, of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I mean, this should be the day for the people of the world to support Israel and to support the fight against anti-Semitism. And we see that that is not what's happening, and that's not how this day is being used. And it was eminently predictable. And in fact, I wrote about it at the time.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we go to look at diaspora Jews or American Jewry, and if we say that they're generally losing interest in Israel as it seems, my question is, does it really matter? Or to put it another way, how much does Israel rely on both the financial and moral support of diaspora Jews to exist?
Well, less than it did in the 1950s. And not only is Israel the largest Jewish community in the world, it's also the strongest Jewish community in the world. And over time, it's probably going to become the most prosperous Jewish community in the world. But I think as you see more and more, discriminatory measures being taken against Jews as purportedly white people in academia, in non-admission of Jewish students to top universities in the United States and other things. And I just wanted, and just in this thing, you have to see that, the Jews' primary identity in the United States, political and religious, since the 1920s and 30s, was that they were on the left politically. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Mainly they're rooted in the labor movement, which the Jews were leading members of. But in the 1960s, there's a good book, I can't remember what it's called, written by a British author about how the British left totally transformed itself from a workers' rights movement in the 1930s and 40s into a neo-Marxist movement in the 1960s. And because it became a neo-Marxist movement that was guided to a large degree by the Soviet Union, the new left in the United States, we saw it with the Black nationalist movement in the 1960s and in other things, that they became progressively more and more hostile to Israel and towards Jews who support Israel. And this left the Jews in the United States. First, they were in a state of shock, Jewish communists first and foremost, but it's escalated over the past 50 years. To the point where today, if you want to be seen as a progressive in good standing, then you have to be anti-Israel. And so today, it's not that it's possible to be anti-Semitic while you're claiming that you're for human rights or support for third world liberation movements. Now, if you want to be considered progressive in good standing, you actually have to be anti-Israel. You have to be hostile to Jews who support Israel. And this has put the American Jewish community increasingly into a bind because they are overwhelmingly on the left. 75%, I think, of American Jews, according to the latest Pew study, view themselves as liberals or centrists. And they vote for the Democrat Party, which has become increasingly hostile to Jews and to Israel. And they're placed in this position almost on a daily basis where they're required to choose between being Jews and being progressives. And I think that you're seeing a lot of the hostility that's being expressed towards Israel by American Jews, and the inability of the larger organized Jewish community, the larger organizations, to stand up for Jewish rights and Jewish civil rights in the United States, including the right to support the Jewish country, the Jewish state. I think you're seeing that it's owing to the stress on their systems from the increased animosity of the left, and that's really the main political cause of the sort of the Jewish community sort of falling apart and being unable to coherently defend itself.
Thank you, David.
Carolyn, I'd like to get your reaction to a few contemporary things, but before I do, I would like to challenge you and say that one of the reasons why we struggle to be good Israel advocates is that there are confusing messages coming out of Israel, confusing messages coming out of the leadership of Israel. Do Jews have a right to live in Judea Samaria? Would be a classic issue. Some would say yes, some would say no, some would say in this part but not in that part. And it creates the impression internationally that, well, maybe the Jewish rights are not clear. And then you go to the holiest site, which is Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. And again, there are confusing messages about the rights of Jews. What's your view on how we see it, that there are conflicting and confusing messages coming out of Israel itself, which is creating problems?
Oh, I have no doubt that, look, Israel is democracy, and there are lots of views, just like there are lots of views in the United States and in Australia and everywhere else. I think, for me, the guiding question is whether Jews have civil rights or not, whether Jews have the right to self-determination in their land. And that's really what's on the plate today. Amnesty International, I have an article coming out in Newsweek magazine today, where I was explaining that, Newsweek, Amnesty International's latest report on Israel, accusing Israel of being an apartheid state, not just in Judea and Samaria, unified Jerusalem, but in all of Israel, really puts the kibosh on the two-state paradigm, because it shows that, this isn't about this territory or that territory. The push on the left is now indistinguishable from the push in Iran or the push among the Palestinians to wipe Israel off the map. Because if Israel doesn't have any right to exist anywhere, and it's a crime against humanity simply by existing, because Jewish nationalism is a racist enterprise and an apartheid enterprise, then people who are on the left are not actually in a conversation about Israel's size. It's not a real estate dispute, who right. should have the national rights in Judea and Samaria. It's saying Jews have to be annihilated as a nation state in the land of Israel. And that's it's precisely what the message of amnesty was. And it's clearly the message of the UN Human Rights Council and of Human Rights Watch and all the rest of them. So, Israelis can have any view that they want to about how it is and whether it's okay for me to be living in my house in Gush Etzion in the town of Efrat. But I think the real question is I think that it's become apparent that the question isn't about whether I should be living in my home in Efrat, but whether I should be living in my homeland of the land of Israel, whether any Jew has a right to this homeland, whether we have a history here, whether we're a people, whether we have a right to be a people, whether we have a right to self-determination. And that's really where the debate is now. So, I think that the best way, as a matter of, practical, what you do, practical organizing, or how you frame a question, is that it's already been reduced to the bare essential. And the bare essential is, do we have a right to political freedom in our country, in our state, in our national homeland or not? And, I would say that just as the ancient Greeks and Nebuchadnezzar, who, put up a statue of Apollo in the holiest of holies on the Temple Mount, was an anti-Semite. He wanted to blot out Jewish civilization, and so did the Romans after him. So too, the people who are trying to erase the history of the Jewish people and co-opt it for the Palestinians are anti-Semites.
For sure. In addition to the Amnesty report, we've had a major local event. You probably heard of it, that there was a Sydney festival, a Sydney Cultural Festival, which was subject to a major BDS push, and somewhere around 1/3 of the participants withdrew in solidarity with Palestine. We have had a debate within the Jewish community here as to whether anti-BDS laws are useful, whether they're useful in the diaspora. AJA has been in favour of it. We had an opportunity some years ago to introduce anti-BDS laws. I'm just going to put on very quickly the draft bill, Contract Prohibition Discriminatory Boycott Bill. As you can see, it's 2018. It was 2019 we were discussing this. And the reason that didn't succeed, it'll come as a great shock to you, is that there were leaders within the Jewish community that opposed it.
Oh.
So I'd be very interested in your view, given that a majority of the American states have anti-BDS. They've used it successfully against Airbnb. It's being invoked now with Unilever and Ben & Jerry's. Does it have merit? Were we on the correct side or the wrong side trying to get up anti-BDS laws in Australia?
I think it's very important. I think it's very important because it's discrimination on the basis of national identity and religion. I mean, I don't think there's any question that this is anti-Jewish discrimination. And I think that one of the things that's important in this is that there's an assault that's being led, at least from a fig leaf perspective, by anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish, I would add, Jewish organizations in the United States to abrogate or replace the definition of anti-Semitism that was published by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, that was adopted by dozens of governments all around the world, including the US government. And the Trump administration applied it as well to the Civil Rights Act in the United States to bar or to treat as anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination, persecution of Jewish students on campus in the context of BDS campaigns. Yeah. So I think that it's extremely important because the BDS actions, in whether it's in economic sphere or in academia on the campuses, creates an extremely hostile and discriminatory environment for Jews. And you know, I think one of the things that's happened since anti-Zionism has become mainstream in the Jewish left in the United States, and I dare say in parts of Australia and other countries, certainly in South Africa, it's a very major factor, is that the Jewish community themselves are having difficulty defending themselves. So I'll give you an example. In my last article that came out on Friday in Israel Hayom, and you can also look at it on my website, and the Newsweek article will be up on my website tomorrow, which is carolynglick.com. The ADL, which is supposed to be the premier organization in the United States for fighting anti-Semitism, refused to refer to the Amnesty International report as anti-Semitic. And this is very dangerous because the ADL now has an annual budget of nearly $100 million. And they pretend to remain the premier organization for fighting anti-Semitism, but actually they're only willing to fight anti-Semitism on the right, which, while it is murderous, as we saw in the synagogue massacre in Pittsburgh and the other one outside of San Diego, it isn't politically powerful. and left-wing anti-Semitism, which is also murderous, as we saw in places like Jersey City, and as we saw in the hostage-taking Islamic anti-Semitism in Texas, is very dangerous to American Jews. Those are the types of anti-Semitism that these mainstream Jewish organizations are no longer capable of fighting. And again, they're extremely powerful politically. They're more powerful than any anti-Semitic movement has been in the United States since the 1930s. So this is a very dangerous period because the Jews are not willing to fight. And so I think that as a practical measure, the Australian Jewish community should not be taking guidance from the Americans. They should be able to call a spade and say these BDS operations, whether they're in the economic realm or in the social realm, in the academic realm, these are acts of these are harassing acts towards Jews. They act to persecute Jews, to deny Jews their right to freedom of speech and expression and organization. And we're going to stand up for Jewish rights. And it has to be seen, I think, as a defense of Jewish rights, because that's precisely what it is. What do they want? They want to silence the Jews. And if you accept that, if you say, okay, well, criticism of Israel is legitimate, it's not criticism of Israel. When you see what their actual agenda is, it's the annihilation of Israel.
For sure.
And it's also the silencing of Jews who don't want Israel to be annihilated. It's very dangerous and it has to be fought. So absolutely, I think you should renew your efforts. I think they're extremely important.
Look, thank you, Carolyn, and you won't have any of that difficulty with us, but I'll just emphasize your point. This is a picture of the wall between Gaza and Egypt. It got no mention in the Amnesty report. It's only when it's a wall that's controlled by Israel is it a problem security measure. Alan, I see there's a lot of questions, so
yes.
let's open up to others.
Okay, just before we go to questions, if you're listening on J-Air, this is the Australian Jewish Association Zoom event, which we hold every Wednesday night. Our guest tonight is Caroline Glick on the future of the Jewish diaspora and other issues. As we always do, I'll just hand back to David for a very quick reminder of what's coming up next week.
Thank you. I will indeed be extremely quick. And firstly, anyone here who is not yet supporting AJA, please at the end of this meeting, if you're not yet a member, go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, join, it only costs you $25, or make a donation, like and follow the AJA Facebook page. It's a very important forum. You can subscribe to our email list on the website to receive notifications of events like this and other information. Next week, we're looking at the subject of the expulsion of Jews from Arab lands with Lynn Julius, who's an expert on the subject. And I just want to point out for people in Sydney that we have a movie night on Sunday at Chabad Double Bay, we're partnering with. Lest we forget, it is about anti-Semitism and how it is translated from older times to current times. And the thing that makes this really special is that the movie producer, Hugh Kitson, will be there and will introduce the movie. Thank you, Alan.
Okay, thanks, David. Now we'll go to questions. I've got Michael, Ron, Jeff, Helen, and I think I saw Anthony there. So Michael, if David will allow you, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
You can you hear me?
That's it.
Yeah. Hi, Carolyn, it's Michael Bird. Some say the biggest threat to Israel's existence is not the Arab and Muslim world, not Iran, but the real problem is coming from within. The instigators of this fifth column threat are the so-called progressive or liberal Jews who promote two Jewish sheep in wolf's clothing extremist organizations, namely the New Israel Fund and their partners Breaking the Silence and J Street. How do you respond when Jews who support these two insidious organizations argue, oh, they do some good things? but obviously ignore or oblivious to the fact that they are pouring fuel on the anti-Semitism fire within our diaspora.
I think that that's true. I mean, I think that they are pouring fire on the flames, or fuel on the flames of anti-Semitism abroad in many ways. And I also think that they're making it more difficult for Jews to defend themselves. And I think that that's really the most pernicious thing, whether it's in Israel by constantly claiming that everything that Israel does to preserve its Jewish identity is racist or discriminatory, and also in the United States by saying that BDS is not, which is a absolutely anti-Semitic campaign, by claiming that it's not at all anti-Semitic and that being against it is harmful to freedom of speech and anti-democratic. This is just not true. These are falsehoods. And again, I think that we've passed the point of no return in terms of the left's abandonment of support for the so-called two-state solution in favor of the simple annihilation of the Jewish state. I think that boat has, that boat has launched. It's no longer in the harbor, and that what we really need to do is just defend ourselves and our rights to exist. And the borders can be determined where they are, wherever they will be. But I mean, that's not the point. Or the point is that I think that the left has rejected the idea that there can be more than one state west of the Jordan River. And so this being the case, the question is, which state is it going to be? And the answer is ours, and we have to be able to defend that. And I think that organizations, particularly Jewish organizations, that really exist in order to bollocks up the community and make it impossible for it to put together a coherent defense against anti-Semitism, both in the diaspora and towards Israel, are real agents of destruction. And they should be called out as such, but they also have to be seen for what they are. This is not a political discussion. In a way, Amnesty's report was a welcome development, because it's so in your face, it's so obvious that that they are no longer paying lip service to the idea of peace. I mean, there's no peace there. They're not saying that Israel can do A and B and C and get peace. They're saying Israel's evil, that Israel's existence in any borders whatsoever is a crime against humanity, that the law of return is an apartheid law. You can't be more clear. This is just the PLO charter, and so when you're looking at that kind of clarity, you have to see it clearly, and you have to operate accordingly. And everybody who tries to muddy the waters is doing just that. And you can't let them diminish the clarity of the moment, because that's their goal. Their goal is to paralyze the community and prevent it from actually taking the sorts of actions that it has to in order to defend itself, whether in Melbourne and Sydney and Perth and all the rest of their cities in Australia, or whether it's the Jewish world more generally and the Jewish state. So I think that, that's the sort of thing that we have to look at when we're looking at organizations like J Street and the New Israel Fund, breaking the silence and the rest.
Ron, please unmute yourself. Just a reminder, folks, please keep your questions as brief as possible.
Hi, Caroline. Can you hear me?
Hi, Ron.
Nice to see you again after all these years.
Yes, me too.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, I'd like to ask you about the role of the European Union and their generous funding of radical NGOs that undermine Israel's sovereignty and national interest. I don't think any other country would allow foreign agents to operate that way. What can be done, to halt this kind of situation, which hemorrhages Israel's sovereignty? That's basically what it does.
Well, I'll tell you two things on two levels. First of all, the state of Israel has to start treating the European Union as hostile, because they're waging a political and economic war and against Israel, both through political subversion at home. Today, my newspaper, Israel Hayom, ran an article which was revealed that the European Union has now opened up a new organization that has a Facebook page that calls for building up the Palestinian identity of El Quds. And they're devoting 3 million euros. It's just a new project. I mean, they spend over 100 million euros a year, 3 million euros just to build up Arab-owned homes in Jerusalem in order to transform Jerusalem into an Arab city. And so they're going to pay Palestinians to build in Jerusalem. They do that here in Efrat as well. You know, there are just vineyards that are owned by Arabs inside of my town of Efrat. And obviously Jews have been trying to buy them from the Arabs for a huge, you know, for a king's ransom, so that we can build on this land. That some of it is, you know, there's a huge area right inside of my neighborhood like that. And the European Union pays them not to sell. And, you know, if you add that to the fact that the Palestinian Authority kills Palestinian landowners who sell their land to Jews, you have this toxic mix that makes it impossible to have normal relations between Jews and Palestinians. And in many ways, the more deeply you look at the Palestinian conflict with Israel, you see it's actually a proxy war. It's Europe's continuation of their war against the Jews, but they're doing it now through a Palestinian proxy. There wouldn't really be a Palestinian conflict with Israel if it weren't for the Europeans. I don't think that I can say it any more starkly. You know, I have a podcast, the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour, that comes out generally on Thursday evenings or Friday mornings. You can subscribe again on my website. And I was speaking last week with Victoria Coates, who, among other things, was the representative of the Secretary of Energy to the Middle East and North Africa during the Trump years, and also Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump. And Victoria was telling me that, you know, basically when Chevron, the American oil company, bought Noble Energy, which is the smaller American company that was developing Israel's gas fields, that essentially the Arab-Israeli conflict ended, because more important than the Abraham Accords, which of course were extremely important, the very fact that an American energy giant would agree to get involved with Israel and Israel's natural gas fields because they no longer feared retribution on the part of the Saudis and the UAE, that's the real indication that the Arab conflict with Israel is over. So why does it fester? Why does it continue to grow? Because it's not an Arab conflict with Israel anymore. Now it's a European conflict with Israel. The Arabs have abandoned it. They want peaceful coexistence with Israel. Another Kuwaiti journalist wrote last week, I think it was, it's on Memory, there's absolutely no reason for us not to normalize relations with the Israelis. And it wasn't that we love Jews, it was that Palestinians are, you know, they suck, and we're not getting anything out of our longstanding support for them, and enough is enough. So, I mean, I think that the Israeli government should treat the European Union as an adversary, because they have an adversarial relations with Israel. They're promoting Palestinian nationalism to advance the cause of Israel's dissolution as a Jewish state. And I think that we have to call them out for that. But I also think that it's important for American Jews, for Australian Jews, to also be having discussions about it, because, you know, I have a friend and colleague in the Knesset named Amichai Shikli, and he and another member of Knesset, Keti Shitrit, were going to have a conference at the Knesset about the EU's promotion of the Palestinian war against Israel, their role in being really the driver of this. And the European Union threw a fit, and they had, you know, all of these demarches and demanded that the Knesset not allow this conference to take place. And in the end, when it was right around the time that we had the Omicron thing coming in, and so the Speaker of the House, Miki Levy, decided to cancel everything and shut down the Knesset. It just happened to be on the day of their conference, because we don't know what's going on with the Omicron variant. And it was a transparent effort to just sort of punt the ball and get the Europeans off their case. And so their hysterical response to Amichai Shikli and Keti Shitrit's planned conference that day that I was actually supposed to speak at was an indication of the fact that what they want the most is to continue operating in the shadows. They don't want anybody to see what they're doing. And so I think it's all the more important for all of us to be shining a light on it.
Yeah, thank you. Amichai Shikli was actually a guest of ours only recently, towards the end of last year. We were all very impressed with him. Jeff, Jeff, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Jeff, are you there? Jeffrey? No, you're muted, Jeff. You need to unmute.
Sorry, I was asleep, believe it or not. I had a very late night last night. My apologies. Given that Caroline mentioned that the outrageous lie of Kofi Annan was indeed a big lie, and as a result of it, he committed one of the greatest blood libels of all time. Why on earth can't we sue the so-and-so? Why on earth can't you take it to the High Court of the global lunatics, whatever their nomenclature is? It's not that one, of course. But why can't we actually ever take them to court and do something about it and cause them to stop it? And
I think, you know, there are a lot. I think that he'd have to take a number. There are so many people that we would be suing at this point. And I don't say that, you know, that's not to belittle the point. I mean, I think when somebody slanders you, you should be able to sue them. But Israel really is being bombarded by these lies and by these libels all the time. I saw just yesterday there was a new one that came out. No, I mean, it was my friend, Professor Eugene Kantorovich, who may have spoken to you in the past. He does a lot with Israel's legal rights into Judea and Samaria. He's an excellent professor of international law from George Mason University. And somebody responded to him saying, you know, we were poisoning the wells or something, and it was some new contemporary way of saying that we were poisoning the wells. And these things come out all the time. They come out in private conversations. They come out in diplomatic statements. They come out in UN operations against Israel, and of course in all of these international human rights organizations. And I think that if you wanted to fight lawfare with lawfare, that would be an excellent idea, although, you know, which tribunals would even be willing to give the Jews a fair hearing is a different question. But I think that, you know, the main thing that has to guide us is that we have to defend ourselves and we have to defend our rights, and we have to be able to cut through all of the efforts that our enemies, Jewish and non-Jewish, are making to try to muddy the waters and not be able to see what they're doing and what the pernicious aims of these various campaigns are against the Jews, and to stand up for ourselves and to stand up for our rights and our freedoms.
Yeah, thank you. Helen, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Caroline, the latest Pew surveys are indicating that intermarriage rates in America are reaching 70% in the secular population, and they're not far behind in Australia, hitting 50%. So in the not too far distant future, we can expect the average Jew in America to be a half Jew. And in Australia, but America is Israel's greatest ally. Is thought being given to this transition, and how do you think it will affect relationships with the diaspora Jew?
Well, I think it's shrinking the diaspora community very quickly. I think that intermarriage, it's just a fast track to disappearing. They show that 85%, I mean, this was in the 2013 Pew survey. I don't know what the data were for last year's, but that among intermarried Jewish and Christian families, 85% of the children did not consider themselves to be Jews. So, you know, that basically means you intermarry, you stop being Jewish within a generation, period. And then there was another corollary to that, which was a follow-on study of the Pew data from 2013 that was done by the Jewish People Policy Planning Institute, or I think that's what it's called. It's the think tank of the Jewish Agency And what they discovered when they were looking at the Pew data was that only 50% of Jewish Americans of marriage age are even married. And, Reformed Jewish women have the lowest birth rate in the United States, fertility rate in the United States. So the Jews are not procreating. They're not procreating with other Jews, and they're not procreating with non-Jews. And the ones who are having children with non-Jews are not having Jewish children with them, regardless of whether you believe in patrilineal descent or not. So I think what we're looking at is the demographic catastrophe as a result of intermarriage. I think that's first and foremost is the impact that it has on the Jewish communities in the diaspora. They're just disappearing.
Anthony, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Carolyn, for your advocacy. If we had to concentrate in the diaspora on what to do, and we're given two or three choices. One is to push very hard for the teaching of Judaism as a way of life, and even in the schools to move away from the emphasis of speaking Hebrew to understanding what Judaism stands for in all its forms? Or should we be concentrating on support of the Israel as the home of Jews, no matter of what variety you are? Or should we be spending equal time on both?
I think that the thing about Zionism is that it is a gateway to a very strong and vibrant Jewish identity for people who aren't religiously, who aren't religious, who aren't interested in having a Jewish lifestyle. I think that if you have a sense of Jewish peoplehood and you have a sense of attachment to the Jewish state as a Jew, then that's 2 out of 3 of the prongs of Jewish identity, the third being the Torah. And I think that that'll get you farther than not having that. I think that Zionism is extremely important to be teaching and guiding and teaching Jewish history from the Zionist perspective rather than the anti-Semitic perspective to Jewish children. I think it's extremely important that they know their history. I think it's extremely important, and not just their history of the Holocaust, but the history of the Jewish people starting back in the Bible and going forward. We have such a rich history that I view it as a form of theft not to teach it to Jewish children. You're stealing their birthright of knowing who they are and how extraordinary it is that they were born Jews after so many years of the diaspora. I think that it's imperative for them to know their history. I think that history makes more sense when they understand Jewish, when they understand the Torah, when it's taught as part of a richer and deeper Jewish identity that's also based on our faith and our traditions and our laws. But I think that if you're living in a secular society and everything is a trade-off, and you're trying to figure out how to maintain your lifestyle and also giving and passing on a very strong and vibrant and sustainable Jewish identity, then I think it's very important to base it on Zionism. But I obviously, if you have the ability to do both, then that's the best. But if I had to choose where to put scarce resources, I would put it in teaching Jewish history, teaching Jewish traditions, and teaching about the centrality of the land of Israel for Jewish identity.
Yes. Charlotte, your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I had 2 questions, but I know time is short, so I'll just ask my second. Bibi was so much more popular in the diaspora compared to within Israel. My relatives in Israel were horrified, but I was impressed with him. Do you think this was influenced by the fact that he was just so fluent in both speaking and comprehending English, And if so, should the next Israeli PM be someone like Melbourne's own son, inverted commas, Mark Regev, who was Melbourne-born, ex-Mount Scopus College student?
Oh, I see. You want the local boy done good. You want him to be the prime minister. Well, that's understandable. Obviously, no. First of all, I disagree with the assumption of your statement. Bibi is by far the most popular politician in Israel. I mean, he leads all other politicians in terms of support for him being prime minister by a factor of 3 at a minimum. I mean, Israelis want him back. And, as a very staunch supporter of Netanyahu, I think that, there's no question that his support is deeply felt, it's authentic, it's widespread, and it's growing. I don't know how closely you've been following the local developments here, but I think that the case that the legal pursuit of Netanyahu by the legal fraternity here in Israel was actually a political effort to oust a president through the misuse of the law has grown much stronger since we found out that Netanyahu's children and his closest advisors were illegally spied on using counter-terrorist spyware in seizing all of their mobile data by the Israel police, oftentimes without a court order. So these kinds of things that were just exposed over the past couple of days in Israel are an earthquake here. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that. But I mean, I don't think you can compare Netanyahu to Bennett. I ran for Knesset with Bennett in the first of the 4 election cycles in 2019. I've known him for many, 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 many years. And I'm profoundly disgusted by his behavior in taking the premiership with the support of 4% of the public. I think that it's a fundamentally anti-democratic move by him and appalling, really. Yes. And so that's neither here nor there. I think that it's important, not necessarily for the Israeli prime minister to speak native English, although as a native English speaker, I'm certainly for that. But I think that it's important for him to have, a very warm and a warm beating Jewish heart who understands that Israel isn't just the state of the Jews living in Israel, but it is the homeland of the Jewish people. And one of the things that I found appalling over the past couple of years of COVID is how they banned tourists from entering Israel. And I think that it caused a rift between diaspora Jews in Israel, that suddenly Jews in the United States and Britain and Australia, throughout the world, were barred from coming to Israel. I think that was a terrible thing to have done. And I think, when Bennett did it over the last time, when the Omicron came, I think it was just terrible. It was a terrible thing to do. And I think that a prime minister with more of a sense of the dual role that Israel plays for the Jewish people wouldn't have considered doing that, particularly now that we have all the vaccines. I think that those are very important. We have a role to play in the lives of Jews all over the world because we are the homeland of the Jewish people. And I think that any actions that are taken to block that connection physically by Israel have to be done with the greatest of caution, only under the most extreme circumstances, which I guess you could say was the exigency at the very outset of Corona, when nobody understood what it was or how lethal it was, and we didn't know how to treat it, and we didn't know how to test for it. That, I guess, made sense, but they have to be as brief as possible and not at all excessive. And so I think that that's also very important.
Okay, now Robert Gregory is our Public Affairs Director. Do you have a written question, Robert?
Yeah, we've got a question here. So, does Israel see evangelical Christians as greater allies than US Jews? And I'll just add, what does that mean going forward? If that's the case, how should Israel interact with American Jews and American Christians and worldwide Jews and Christians?
Well, I mean, our current foreign minister, Yair Lapid, has spoke, I think, idiotically, which isn't surprising because I think he's an idiot, but he spoke disparagingly of evangelical Christians. And I think that's just a crazy thing to do because they are the most important demographic of support for Israel in the United States. And, you know, maybe liberal Jews don't like them, but that's really the problem of liberal Jews. And Israel has, again, if you're talking about the dual interests of Israel, Israel has to protect itself and maintain its relationship with the United States government, and with all or as many sectors of American society as possible. And you don't do that by disparaging the largest bloc and the most powerful bloc of support that Israel has in the United States. So I thought that that was an incredibly horrible thing to have done. But it's clear that, you know, a lot of what dictates his policies towards the United States are his social tastes. And he's a liberal, you know, he's what we used to call the United States a limousine liberal, and he likes to be with them. And so he doesn't understand evangelical Christians. He doesn't understand faith because he's not a believer. And it's a problem. But I think that evangelical Christians are the bedrock of American support for Israel, and that Israel has a national interest in cultivating close ties and working relationships with evangelical leaders in the United States. I think the same is true of conservative Catholic leaders. I think obviously it's true of Jewish leaders, but Israel can't be seen as disparaging our closest supporters in the United States.
Okay, thanks. Now, I see there's a couple of other hands up, but we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Caroline, I'm amazed at how tireless you are in the work that you do, and we're all the better for it. And you inspire us, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's just been fabulous. You have a lot of fans in Australia who support your very strongly pro-Jewish and pro-Israel advocacy. So thank you again, and please don't stop doing what you're doing. It's too important.
Well, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you guys again. You know, we really, really loved Australia, and you guys are a fantastic Jewish community. And 4.5 years later, we're still so appreciative in our family of the incredible warmth that you extended to us when we were there. So I have nothing but good things. I have nothing but good thoughts and feelings towards you guys, and I appreciate the opportunity to see you guys again, albeit on Zoom, and hopefully you'll all be coming to Israel soon, and we can see you.
You're welcome at any time. Now, I see your book just is very coincidentally positioned over your right shoulder. So I don't think our audience needs to be introduced to it, but it can be. I'm sure it's at all the book sites. Now, you did mention your blog again. Just repeat the address for people that want to.
It's basically an archive of all of my articles, and it's carolineglick.com, spelled my name, CAROLINE GLICK, one word.com. And so you can get all of my materials there, my podcast. You can subscribe to my YouTube or Rumble or whatever channels that you want through my website, and read my articles and stay in touch. I'm happy to be in touch with you guys. So I have to go and write my article. They're waiting for it at the paper. So I wish you all good evening, and thank you again.
Okay, thanks, Caroline.
Thank you so
we'll
much.
let you go. Now, just before we go, the L'chaim program with Morris Klein is on 3ZZZ right now, FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au. That's all we have for tonight. Please join us next week for another special event in our series. That will be Lynn Julius talking about the expulsion of Jews from Arab lands. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with what AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. Please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you next week as usual. So it's bye from me. Good night to everybody.